All right, crim 28. Let's knock out this chapter 2. How probation developed, chronicling its past and present. So these are all of the learning objectives for this particular chapter. Oh, and that one. I didn't know that last one was there. So we are going to start with precursors to American probation. And ultimately what we want to talk about is what did we used to do before there was probation? And a lot of people probably aren't aware of the fact that early on, even in American and British history, and because we got a lot of our criminal justice system, we took a lot of that, the ideas, concepts from Britain, from England. Our settlers came from England, and although we didn't like some of the laws from England, we certainly liked enough of them to take and bring a lot of their laws over to the United States when we came here. But a lot of times, instead of people being punished by being locked up or incarcerated, it had to do with money. So these were basically their punishments were either involving money or physical punishment, corporal punishment, being beaten, whipped, killed, whatever. So this amercement was money that had to be paid in order for a person to get out of custody. Security is the same type of deal. Security was kind of like a bond or a bail that someone would pay, and they would pay the money and be given the opportunity to get out of custody. And ultimately, if they paid their fines, they were given the opportunity to ultimately have their charges dismissed. So you can imagine it sounds kind of shady, and a lot of the legal system was shady at that time. What if you didn't have the money? You can imagine that ultimately a lot of poor people didn't have the opportunity to, oops, I didn't mean to skip over that. So this Commonwealth versus Chase case gives kind of an example of what we call a suspended sentence. And a suspended sentence is something that's still used today, and ultimately it is the example or the definition of what probation is. Even now, when people are placed on probation, a judge will typically say, I hereby sentence you to a period of time in custody of 3 years, that being suspended pending a certain period of time on probation. And when they use the word suspended, they mean they're kind of holding it over someone's head, saying, if you screw up, I am going to impose that sentence. If you don't, and you do everything I tell you to do, that's all going to go away. So the Commonwealth versus Chase case in 1831 is probably the first case when a judge said, I'm going to give you an opportunity to go out into the community, take care of business, do what you're supposed to do. But if you screw up and get arrested again, or don't do what I've told you to do, I am going to impose the sentence for this crime that you've committed now. I don't know, does that make sense? So a suspended sentence, that's ultimately what probation is. It is the judge saying you have the opportunity to live in the community, take care of your business, and live among us. But if you can't handle that, too bad, so sad, you're going to go to prison, and I'm going to basically revoke that suspended sentence and impose the actual sentence and make you go to prison. I don't know if that, hopefully that kind of makes sense. And then the ex parte versus United States was kind of the federal case where they kind of, it all kind of tied together into federal law. Okay, so the next, oops, that's not what I meant to do. That's not what I meant to do either. Why am I not able to go to my next slide? Okay, so founders of probation. Ultimately, this guy is my dude right here, John Augustus. So John Augustus was a fairly rich guy. He was in the Boston area, and his family owned a shoe factory. So he was pretty wealthy, and for whatever reason, he was interested in the court system. So during his free time, sometimes he would go sit and hang out in the courthouse and see kind of what was going on and how the cases were being handled in the courthouse. So as he sat there, he watched a lot of cases where people were ultimately either they were poor and their main issue was alcoholism. So they couldn't pay to get themselves out of custody, and they didn't have the tools they had no way to get money to earn money, and they were, terrible alcoholics with basically no future, no life. One day in court, he decided that he was going to volunteer to take someone home with him. He says, "Judge, may I? If you allow me, I'm going to take this guy home. I'm going to teach him a trade. He can work in my shoe company. I'm going to get him sober, and I'm going to bring him back here a new person, and we'll be able to pay off his fines then because he's going to have a job, and he'll be clean and sober. And then hopefully we can resolve this case and he'll be good to go." And the judge said, "Knock yourself out. Go ahead." And he did. And that was kind of how it started, with one person like that. Little by little, other kind of wealthy people, volunteers, philanthropists, started doing the same, going to the courthouse, taking people home, bringing them home with them, and trying to help them, trying to better them. That was the initial concept of probation. Now, obviously, that's not what I was doing, 5 years ago. It turned into a career. It turned into a profession where people actually got paid to do it, and then people were allowed to live in their own homes. But ultimately, John Augustus was, I think he's considered the father of probation. And that's ultimately how it all started. Matthew Davenport Hill basically did the same type of thing, but his claim to fame was starting probation in England. So similar, but he actually did his work in England. So we talked about the fact that probation started in Boston in the United States, and obviously that was kind of a local, kind of a smaller scale, but the feds kind of resisted it. They were not very excited about the concept of offenders being able to walk free and live in the community. And it sounds like it was there were 34 unsuccessful attempts to enact probation legislation before it finally made it through the legislation and to President Coolidge, who happened to have been from Massachusetts. So because he was from Boston, he knew a lot about probation because that's kind of where it all started. So he was on board with it. So that was 1925, I believe, when he signed that into law. They hired one salaried probation officer. Yeah, $2,600 was how much money he made per year. I know, crazy, huh? Then the following year, they hired 8 more. Then ultimately, they were able to, in 1940, dramatically increase the numbers. And then 1984, interesting, we're probably going to talk about this a little bit later, but federal parole was abolished. So right now, there is no such thing as federal parole. There is still federal probation, and it's actually very, very popular. There are a lot of offenders on federal probation and 0 on federal parole. So anyways, this is kind of how it came through the system. So talking about juveniles now. Ultimately, juveniles and adults were treated exactly the same when they went through the court system. They were typically disciplined by their parents or other adults in the community, but ultimately, if they ended up in the criminal justice system, they were treated like adults. They were in adult jails, adult courts, things like that. And about, what does it say, in 1817 to 1840, the Quakers came into the United States, and they believed that children needed to be treated differently. So they came up with a different idea on how to save the children. They ended up placing them in the foster home type of a situation, or even an orphanage type of situation, which in their minds at the time was a good idea. You can imagine the abuses that took place in those types of facilities as well. But the Juvenile Court Act of 1899 was the first time when an actual, real juvenile court was established in the United States. Oh, parens patriae is not even mentioned in your PowerPoints, but parens patriae is important. This is a concept that came, again, from England, but this is basically the idea that the King of England was frustrated because there were so many children who, in his opinion, were not being cared for properly by their parents. So he ultimately decided to take charge of those children and make all legal decisions on their behalf. So I describe parens patriae in an easy way to remember as basically the court is your daddy. So we still use this now. If you're in juvenile court now, the court gets to step in and act as a parent figure and make decisions on behalf of the juvenile when the parent has failed to do so. So this is still a concept that we use in the United States. Sorry. New York's probation laws allowed police officers to be probation officers. Think about that. The training that you think police officers have versus the type of training that probation officers might have. Okay. Other states did not allow that. Early probation workers were volunteers because new laws did not fund their salaries. Interesting, huh? Could you imagine being a volunteer probation officer? Probation today, very different world, very different world. We do a lot of informal or diversion type of services, probation does today. Now this means that people are not actually going through the court system. These are programs that help to avoid the court system. Things like drug court, things like restorative justice. These are programs that keep people out of the criminal justice system while still addressing whatever the issue is they have. Most, in fact, if not all, probation departments, are they county or state? Ding, ding, ding. Yes, county. Most of them are county. I worked for the Fresno County Probation Department. So you'll remember a couple slides ago, I said that New York, they didn't have funding for probation officers. Well, now we have the Community Corrections Act. So that's required that correction officers, including probation officers, are required to be funded so that they can receive the services as well. All right, and then we have kind of a breakdown of the way supervision has evolved throughout time in the United States. So ultimately, kind of started, the whole concept was to allow for an individual to live in the community and not be incarcerated while trying to work on whatever the problem is that caused them to commit the criminal act. Okay, so because again, we're talking about corrections. We're trying to correct a problem, right? Corrections, correctional supervision. We're correcting a problem. They got arrested for a reason. We're trying to figure out what that reason is and correct the problem. So early days, the casework model, the probation officer kind of did everything. They were the therapist. They were the support system. They tried to kind of really be the cheerleader, the therapist, the hand holder, the everything to their client at this point. When they realized that, probation officers aren't necessarily trained therapists, don't necessarily know how to do everything, kind of moved on to this next model. brokerage of services model, where they identified what the needs were and then referred them for services. So if I met with a client and I thought, I think they need some mental health counseling, then I would refer them for counseling. I wouldn't try to counsel them myself because I'm not a mental health counselor. Then we moved on to the justice model. Now, what happened during this time, and you'll probably hear me talk about this again, crack era right here. The crime rates were through the roof. Things were getting really insane in our community. Violent crime was off the charts. We were just arresting people during this time. So this was a lot of arrest and lock them up. So then 2001 to present, what we've been trying to do is build relationships in the communities, in the neighborhoods where people live and work. For example, school-based probation officers. I was over at Hoover High School, so I was pretty familiar with all the programs that we offered in the neighborhoods. I knew the counselors from the drug treatment programs in the area because I had so many kids that went to those particular programs. So what we did was build relationships in those neighborhoods. And this is the newer kind of concept where we were trying to. This has been hard, and I will admit this. Listen more to the offender and understand their needs more, as opposed to deciding on my own what their needs are. I don't even know if that makes sense, but I'm going to read from the book what it says. It says, a community style emphasizing motivational interviewing and meaningful professional relationships between clients and officers in a dual role as therapeutic change agent and an enforcer. I know, right? This has been tough. Okay. Moving on. Who's on probation? 3 out of 4 people on probation are men. Women on probation have increased 21% in 1995 to 25% in 2013. And there's a beautiful chart in your book on page 37. It has a bunch of statistics. On average, 54% of probationers are white, 30% African American, 14% Hispanic, 2% Native American, and or Pacific Islander, Asian Pacific Islander. Is this going to be different for where we live? It probably is. This is nationwide. I strongly suggest you read this chapter. I strongly suggest that you read this. Read the book. Okay. Done.